North by Northwest, it's one of those movies that just seems to get better every time you see it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, and the stuff you shared, like, I don't know, behind the scenes photos, articles about like specific scenes, even stuff about Mount Rushmore, it really makes you appreciate it on like a whole new level.
What I think is so fascinating about North by Northwest is how it works on like multiple levels. It's this really thrilling spy story, but it's also a stylish kind of like time capsule of what America looked like in the 1950s.
Right.
And then, of course, underneath all of that, you have Hitchcock's signature suspense, keeping you on the edge of your seat.
Totally. And speaking of suspense, that article about the crop duster scene, I mean,
Yeah.
wow. It really like blew my mind.
Yeah.
I mean, who else could take a place that's like a bright, sunny field, wide open, and make it feel so unsettling?
It's really interesting because you kind of like expect danger to be lurking in the shadows, right? Not out in the open.
Right.
And it's interesting, too, because he actually shot that scene on location in California.
Wait, really?
Yeah, not in Illinois, as the film suggests.
I had no idea.
Yeah, and the article even mentions that you can actually find the spot on Google Maps today.
Wow. That's
So,
so cool.
yeah, it's just fun to think about how these seemingly ordinary places can have this whole other life, in cinematic history.
It really is. It's like finding hidden treasure or something, but instead of gold, it's like a piece of film history.
Exactly.
Speaking of cinematic history, we have to talk about those behind-the-scenes pictures,
Oh, yeah.
especially the ones at the United Nations. I mean, those are incredible. They actually filmed at the UN, right?
Well, there's a little bit more to the story.
Oh, I knew there had to be. Okay, tell me everything.
So Hitchcock actually, he wanted to film inside, but the UN, they said no.
Really?
So, Hitchcock being the resourceful filmmaker that he was, he came up with this plan.
Okay.
He hid a camera inside a carpet cleaning truck
What?
across the street.
You're
And
kidding.
Cary Grant just casually walked by.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Only Hitchcock.
I know, it's kind of wild, right?
It's incredible that he was able to get that shot. I mean, he always seemed to find a way to make it happen.
He really did. He had such a clear vision, and he was so dedicated to bringing it to life.
He did, and it makes you think about how they used to have to do things back then. Because, I mean, today, that scene would be all CGI,
Totally.
but in North by Northwest, it's real.
Right.
And that just adds to the suspense. And, it's those little details that really make a difference.
They do.
And speaking of details, can we talk about Cary Grant's suits for a minute?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that gray suit that he wears throughout the entire film, it's iconic.
It's true. I think GQ even voted it the best suit in film history or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And it just goes to show how influential that one stylistic choice was. Designers are still kind of riffing on that look today.
It's amazing how something as simple as a suit can become such a, style icon.
I know, it's true.
But, it's not just about looks either, because that suit plays a really important role in the plot, too. Remember when it gets covered in insecticide during that crop duster scene?
Oh, of course. How could I forget?
Right.
Such a seemingly insignificant detail, but it becomes really important later on.
Well-
And it shows how much Hitchcock was paying attention to every little thing.
He really was. And how he wove those details into the bigger story.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we move on, we have to talk about Mount Rushmore. I mean, wow.
It's impressive, right?
Those set photos are just breathtaking. And you can tell that they didn't actually film the entire climax there on location.
Right.
But you would never know it from watching the movie.
Right. They were such masters of like matte paintings and miniatures, and these really clever editing techniques. It's amazing what they were able to accomplish.
Especially for that time period.
I know. It makes you really appreciate the artistry and the ingenuity of those early filmmakers.
It really does. Although it does make you wonder how Hitchcock would have approached that scene with all the technology they have available today.
Right. Would he have gone full CGI, or would he have stuck with those practical effects? It's a good question.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And get this, the article mentioned that the National Park Service wasn't too happy about Hitchcock wanting to film a murder on Mount Rushmore, even if it was all staged.
Oh, I bet.
There must have been some interesting conversations going on behind the scenes to get that approved.
I'm sure Hitchcock had to pull out all the stops to film there.
I bet he did.
Yeah, because, it's such an iconic landmark.
Absolutely.
And Hitchcock, he was known to push the envelope a little bit.
He did. And speaking of pushing the envelope, have you noticed how many kind of suggestive lines made it past the censors in this film?
Oh, yeah.
Especially that scene in the dining car with Cary Grant and Eva Marie saying,
Oh, yeah.
It's like every other line has some kind of double meaning.
The sexual tension in that scene is amazing, right?
Palpable.
It really is. Hitchcock was such a master of conveying so much without actually saying it explicitly.
He really was.
Subtle and sophisticated all at the same time.
It really is. He was definitely walking a fine line.
Oh, yeah.
But he managed to create one of the most iconic and subtly seductive scenes in all of cinema.
He really did.
And you know what was really interesting is that one of the articles mentioned that they actually had to redub one of Eva Marie Saint's lines because it was considered too suggestive for audiences back then.
Wow. It's funny how, what was considered scandalous back then is, no big deal today.
I know, right?
It really makes you realize how much times have changed.
It does. And it's interesting because one of the things that really struck me while I was reading these articles was how Hitchcock uses all that open space to create this sense of unease.
Oh, yeah.
It seems counterintuitive. You'd think that wide open spaces would make you feel safe. But in Hitchcock's hands, they almost become menacing.
It's true. Think about that crop duster scene again. You have Cary Grant, this sophisticated man of the world who's suddenly stranded in the middle of nowhere with nowhere to hide, nowhere to run.
Right.
That vast landscape, it's almost like it becomes a character in itself,
It does.
Amplifying his vulnerability.
Yeah, it's even though it's empty, it's like that emptiness kind of closes in on you.
Right, exactly.
And it's not just the crop duster scene either. I mean, think about that opening sequence at the United Nations.
Yeah.
You would think a place that's so public and bustling would feel safe.
Mm.
But Hitchcock somehow frames Roger Thornhill as being incredibly isolated, even though he's surrounded by people.
That's such a good point.
It's like he's walking through these crowds, but he seems utterly alone.
Exactly. And that feeling of isolation, that sense of being surrounded by danger, but not being able to see it, that is classic Hitchcock.
So good.
He was a master of that.
He really was.
Using those open spaces, not to give you a sense of freedom, but to heighten the anxiety.
Right.
The world itself has become a threat.
Which I guess makes sense when you think about how much Hitchcock loves the whole wrong man trope.
Totally.
I mean, Roger Thornhill is the definition of that.
He's just going about his life, and then bam, he's suddenly thrust into this world of spies and mistaken identity and...
It's terrifying.
Exactly. That feeling of being caught up in something you don't understand, being pursued by forces that are beyond your control.
It's like a nightmare.
It is. And it taps into this primal fear we all have, right?
Totally.
The fear of the unknown, the fear of being falsely accused, the fear of being hunted.
Scary stuff.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is how Hitchcock takes these places that seem totally normal, like a busy city street or a train station or even a cornfield.
Right.
And he turns them into these places of paranoia and suspicion.
That's so true.
You start to see the world through Roger Thornhill's eyes.
Exactly.
And you start to question everything and everyone.
That's the mark of a true master filmmaker.
It is.
Taking the mundane and making it terrifying and reminding us that danger can really lurk anywhere. It's true. But, we've talked a lot about the suspense, but North by Northwest isn't all shadowy figures and, scary moments.
Right.
There's also a really playful, almost comedic side to it, too.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of humor in there.
The banter between Cary Grant and Eva Marie Saint is fantastic.
It's so witty.
It's like they're having this elegant dance of flirtation and danger.
It's true. And they're constantly kind of one-upping each other with their words, especially in that dining car scene.
Oh, my gosh, that scene.
So good.
It's amazing how Hitchcock can balance all that suspense with these moments of genuine humor.
Yeah, he doesn't take himself too seriously.
He really doesn't. It's like he's winking at the audience hey, this is a suspenseful thriller, but we can still have a little fun with it, right? Exactly. And I think that's a big part of why people love North by Northwest so much. It's just so rewatchable because it's got all these different elements going on.
It really does.
It's suspenseful and stylish and funny.
It's got it all.
Yeah, it really does. And, beyond being a really entertaining film, it also had a pretty significant cultural impact. One of the articles you sent me even called it a precursor to the James Bond films.
Oh, totally. I see it.
Yeah.
You've got the globe-trotting and the glamorous women and this suave leading man who always seems to be, one step ahead of everyone else.
Right.
You can definitely see how North by Northwest helped to pave the way for those movies.
And it's not just the superficial stuff either.
Right.
North by Northwest and those early Bond films, they both gave us this kind of hero who's incredibly capable but also kind of flawed.
Right.
They're both navigating this world of espionage, but they're doing it with this mix of wit and resourcefulness that really changed how we think about those kinds of stories.
And they both look really good doing it.
Exactly.
But, it's interesting that you bring up the hero's flaws, because one thing that really struck me about Roger Thornhill is how, despite being thrown into this completely insane situation, he actually goes through this pretty incredible transformation throughout the film.
He does.
Like, he's a different person by the end.
Yeah, he really is. At the beginning of the film, he's so defined by his work and his social status.
Right.
He's a successful advertising executive. He's used to being in control.
Right.
But then when he's mistaken for George Kaplan, that whole identity just completely crumbles around him.
Right. It's like he's being forced to confront this totally different version of himself. And this world that he's been thrown into and doesn't care about his fancy suits or his clever comebacks.
No, it doesn't.
He has to adapt or die.
Exactly. He's constantly having to become someone else just to survive.
Right.
I mean, he goes from being this polished executive to, like, disguising himself as an old man at that auction house.
Oh, my gosh. That scene kills me every time.
It's hilarious.
It's so good. But it really shows how he's being forced to let go of that old identity.
It does.
Like, he has to shed that skin in order to survive.
Right.
It's almost like Hitchcock is saying, you have to lose yourself to find yourself.
Yeah, I love that, because it's through this process of being stripped bare, confronting danger and uncertainty,
Right.
that Roger Thornhill ultimately kind of discovers this deeper, more authentic version of himself.
He starts out thinking he's this suave, sophisticated businessman, but by the end, he's faced his fears, he's embraced adventure, he's even found love.
He has.
In the most unlikely of places.
He's a changed man.
He's gone on a journey.
He has, both literally and figuratively.
So true.
Yeah.
So by the time we get to that final scene on Mount Rushmore,
Yeah.
he's not just an advertising executive anymore.
Right. He's more than that.
He's like a fully realized version of himself.
Exactly. He shed the trappings of his old life and come out the other side transformed.
He has, and that's what makes North by Northwest more than just a fun spy movie,
It is.
It's a story about identity, about the masks we all wear, and the journey of self-discovery.
Beautifully said.
It's pretty amazing how much depth Hitchcock is able to pack into what on the surface could have been just another action thriller.
I know, it's really a testament to what a genius he was.
He's a master storyteller.
He understood that the most powerful stories, they're not just about the plot.
Right.
They're about the human experience, what it means to be alive in a world that never stops changing.
That's so true. Well, this deep dive has been amazing.
It has.
I had no idea there was so much to unpack in North by Northwest.
It's fun to dig a little deeper sometimes, right?
It is. It really makes you wonder how many other layers are hiding in plain sight, even in the films we think we know so well.
That's a great question.
That's something to think about, I guess.
Yeah.
Until next time, happy viewing, everyone.